All right, this lecture is going to get into the early battles of the Civil War. And so the first thing to talk about is the overall plan for the Union Army. So we've got General-in-Chief at the time, Winfield Scott. He creates the Anaconda Plan, which is a three-part plan. The first part of the plan is we want to surround the South by naval blockade. And in doing this, we're cutting off any potential trade that the South could have with Europe. Part two of the plan is we want to divide the South from kind of the mainland from the west by taking the Mississippi River. The third part of the plan is capturing Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. And so with this, we've got our funky little dance move, and that we want to surround, divide, and capture. And so Lincoln says, nah, how about we skip straight to part three and capture Richmond, because we really need to end this war as fast as possible. So Lincoln is going to urge troops to march on Richmond right away, and we see 30,000 Union troops who leave, headed towards Richmond in July of 1861. This leads to the first major battle, and so we've got the main Confederate army of 22,000 positioned in northern Virginia, and they're just south of the Bull Run River at Manassas. And so with this, we've got the Union Army that meets up with the Confederate Army, and the Union attacks on July 21st of 1861, and with this, we've got the Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas. So when we come to Civil War battles, they oftentimes have two names, and that the Union is going to identify their battles as whatever geographical distinction is closest. And so we've got a river, Bull Run, hence the Battle of Bull Run. And the Confederacy, they're going to name their battles after the nearest town, hence the Battle of Manassas. And so the Union, they seem to be coming close to a decisive victory, but then right at the last minute, the Confederacy, they win. Looking into how this happened, so the Confederacy is really putting up a strong fight. We've got a strong Confederate general, Thomas Jackson, and his brigade is going to stand strong like a Stonewall, which then gives the nickname Stonewall Jackson to the general. But what really saves them is we get the arrival of more Confederate troops from Shenandoah nearby. And so with the arrival of more Confederate troops, the Union really freaks out, they panic, and they flee the battlefield, which results in Confederate victory. Looking into the overall results of the battle, so the Confederacy is going to make no attempt to follow up on their victory and march on Washington, and this is mainly because they were disorganized and short on supplies. So at this point in time, the Confederacy is not yet ready to take on the Union capital. It's also unlikely that capturing Washington would have ended the war, and that yes, it would be a major blow to the Union, but if anything, it would have just united the Union in coming together and stopping their enemy, ending this war once and for all. And even with the defeat at Bull Run, the Union troops are really motivated to learn from their mistakes and to do better next time, to outsmart the Confederacy and have a Union victory. Looking into General McClellan, so after Bull Run, McClellan is going to become the General-in-Chief of the Potomac and replacing General Scott, the creator of the Anaconda Plan. So the Army of Potomac, they're going to be the main army of the Union. They're really important. We'll talk about them plenty of times. So McClellan is an interesting guy just because he wants to win the war by maneuver and without too much gore. He is not willing to risk the lives of his troops, and so because of this, he's going to fail to collaborate with Lincoln because Lincoln tells him, you need to attack, you need to defeat Lee, let's end this war. And McClellan is really hesitant, he's overcautious, and he's indecisive just because he is 100% convinced that Lee has more men than he does. So because of this, he doesn't want to attack, he wants to preserve his army. And so McClellan, stand-up guy if you want to live. So you'd want him to be your general and that you want to survive and come out at the other end of the war. However, with this, you're going to lose the war. So he really frustrates Lincoln. Looking into why was McClellan moving so slow? In January of 1862, Lincoln is really frustrated and he orders McClellan to attack. McClellan has typhoid fever, and so he decides to not do a direct march on Richmond because he's not ready for that yet. Instead, he stations his army between Richmond and between the rebel army at Manassas. So you've got the Confederate troops in between who start to withdraw, and McClellan at this point plans to attack Richmond by going up the peninsula. And with this, he'll be in between two rivers, and it will avoid him doing a frontal attack. So with this, he's able to preserve his army, not lose as many lives. A couple months later, in 1862, McClellan's army is 70 miles away from Richmond, so they're slowly but surely getting closer to the capital. A Confederate general is able to convince McClellan that he has 1,000 more troops than he actually does by just continuously marching his troops around and around. And so McClellan, he sees this, he freaks out, and he decides to not attack, but besiege the town of Yorktown instead. So he's not going to attack the Confederate army. He's going to surround this town because he's freaked out. He's scared. He's fooled. Doing this, however, it's giving Davis more time to send more Confederate troops to the peninsula to help out Lee's army. And so with this, the Confederacy, they keep drawing back and drawing back before McClellan can actually attack. They're waiting for more men to come to their aid. And so McClellan, he's moving cautiously, and he finally reached Richmond in May. But he's still convinced that he's outnumbered, and so again, he's going to wait for more reinforcements. So looking into General Lee, Lee had some setbacks early on in the war. However, he does become Davis's military advisor because he's the best soldier and the best general that the Confederacy has to offer. And so Lee's army is going to be the Army of Northern Virginia. So we've got Army of Northern Virginia, main Confederate Army, Army of Potomac, main Union Army. And so with his army, Lee is determined to join up with Jackson to take the initiative and to attack McClellan's flank. Looking into the next battle that we have, the 7 Days Battles, this is going to be a set of battles that takes place across a span of a week, and it starts in late June of 1862 when Lee attacks in Virginia. And so Lee attacks. He's waiting for Jackson, but Jackson is slow to arrive, and so Lee ends up a bit unsuccessful in that we've got our week of battles spanning from June 27th to July 1st, and there's a lot of overcomplicated battle plans, and because they are so complicated, we have poor command and poor attacks by the Confederacy. And with this, Jackson's also going to underperform, and that if the plans were simplified, it would have been easier. We might have had a different outcome, but the rebel forces are able to break through enemy lines. And so Lee's able to save Richmond, and he tells McClellan to get back. He forces McClellan to retreat. Looking into the next battle, the Battle of Antietam, this one has an interesting story to it in that McClellan had sent out a scout to look over where Lee's army had last set up camp, and with this he finds Lee's battle plans, and so now McClellan, he's got an advantage. He looks at the battle plans and he sees that Lee's army is divided, and so McClellan is in a strong position to attack because he's finally got the numbers right in front of him. He has more numbers than Lee does. And so what McClellan does at first is he forces Lee back towards the Potomac River. But instead of Lee retreating all the way back to Virginia, Lee decides to position his army between Antietam Creek. And so for whatever reason, McClellan, he messes up, he delays, and Jackson is able to rejoin Lee's army. And so even with Jackson and Lee working together with their armies, McClellan still has a 2-to-1 advantage when he attacks on September 17th. And so with this, we're able to break up the Battle of Antietam into 3 separate battles and 3 separate attacks. So these attacks are going to be gradual by the Union. We've got the first attack coming from the north, the second attack coming from the center, where the Confederacy is taking cover in Bloody Lane. And then the third and final attack is coming from the south, right across Antietam Creek. All 3 Union attacks are only going to be partially successful, and Lee's able to hold on and stand his ground, and he's really aided out a lot by the arrival of more troops from Harper's Ferry. And so with these battles, we see major casualties on both sides, and so the Battle of Antietam becomes the bloodiest single-day battle of the entire war. We've got Lee's loss at 11,000 men and McClellan's loss at 12,000, so both sides losing big numbers. Looking into, was Antietam the turning point of the war? So one major thing is Lee is going to retreat into Virginia, and McClellan is going to claim victory. So some arguments as to why Antietam was a big turning point is that within days of the battle, Lincoln is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The second thing is that Lee's failure during the battle means that Britain is very unlikely to intervene. Lee really wanted some foreign aid, but in order to gain that, he really needed a decisive victory where he was able to attack or defend and have total victory, but this doesn't happen, so Britain is out. And McClellan is also going to fail to follow up this victory. And so because McClellan, he's a coward, he refuses to attack, Lincoln gets tired of it and he replaces McClellan with General Burnside. Looking into the Emancipation Proclamation, so in April of 1862, slavery is abolished in Washington, D.C. However, we are going to compensate slave owners, and we are going to support colonization and sending freed slaves back to Africa. So a little while later in June, Congress also abolishes slavery in all federal territories. And then a month after that, Congress passes the Confiscation Act. And this is going to be really important because this allows Union seizure of all enemy property. And so the Union is taking the Confederacy's words and turning it right against them, and that the Confederacy said that slaves are their property, and they have the right to take their property anywhere they want. So the Union, they use that word property against the Confederacy, and that if they capture a town, they're allowed to take and confiscate any property that comes with that town. So this includes weapons, and it now includes slaves. And so in seizing property and in seizing slaves, slaves are going to be set forever free by the Union. There was some resistance in Congress in that some people thought it went too far, some people thought it didn't go far enough, and so while this is important, it wasn't universally supported. Another important note with this, though, is that slaves are only going to gain freedom before a federal court, and that the Union has to prove that the slave owner was a rebel in order to grant them freedom. And really, this only gets money when we talk about border states, and that they have to be a rebel in order, or the slave owner has to be a rebel in order for us to grant the slaves freedom, because if it's not, then we're starting to get into some tricky, some unsupported territory as far as laws go. The last thing we'll look at is looking at why is Vicksburg important to the South. So we've got Vicksburg, a small little town right across, or right along the Mississippi River, and it's important because this is a fortified town that's going to prevent the Union control of the Mississippi. So we have to take over this town in order to go through with part 2 of our plan in dividing the South via the Mississippi River. So in the winter of 1862 to 63, the Union forces under General Grant are going to try and take Vicksburg. And so it's going to be tricky at first just because we have natural defenses that makes it difficult to get to, difficult to capture. This is also going to be really important. Vicksburg is important to Davis just because it's holding the South together. And so in losing Vicksburg, we're losing communications between the South and the Southwest. And so as Union threat to Vicksburg grew, Davis is going to appoint a Confederate general to oversee the West to try and organize and to concentrate general and military effort. However, the general's power is unclear, and we still see Western generals commanding independently. So Davis's plan doesn't really go as planned. And we will stop here.